today's webinar, Fundraising in a Pandemic, the 4 impact point of view, grow your impact and income. This is actually our kickoff event for a series of webinars that we are doing over the month of February and March to help you kind of deal with fundraising during a pandemic. It's thrown us all for a loop since last March or April. And first we had to figure out how to do instruction, and now we've got to figure out how to sustain our program. So we're going to try to help you figure out how to do that. For those of you who have attended our webinars before, you know that we are recording this webinar. We will send a follow-up email on Monday, so that's next Monday. It'll have a link to the webinar recording. Kerry has agreed to share her slideshow. We'll have a sheet that'll be a summary of the key points that Kerry goes over, as well as a chat transcript, the Q&A transcript, and a certificate for attending. Just a little bit about the controls and how we're going to run things today. So we're going to ask, there are 2 ways to kind of communicate with us. We're going to ask that you use the chat to introduce yourself, to share links and resources with the group. When Kerry mentions a link to a resource, I'll try to post that link into the chat area. And if you want to ask questions, if you see that someone else has made a comment in the chat and you want to ask questions to the group, that's what you can use that chat function for. If you have a content question for Kerry, we're going to ask that you click on that Q&A button and enter that question into the Q&A feature. This allows us to track your questions and make sure everybody's question gets answered. Kerry has been gracious enough to agree to stick around after the top of the hour when the webinar is over, just to make sure that everybody's questions get answered. So this will help us track. You can go to proliteracy.org/webinars to find our webinar schedule. If hopefully you've been attending them and you know where this is. We have a calendar there that has all our kind of general webinars, as well as webinars from New Readers Press and our membership webinars. We also include links to our previous webinars. We have a playlist of previous webinars, and I think you can also, for most of them, go back in the calendar and find a link to them there. So I mentioned that this is a series that we're doing. We have 4 more webinars following this. 3 of them are around kind of doing virtual fundraising events. So these are folks that have actually successfully converted or created a virtual fundraising event. We've got a virtual spelling bee. We've got a great fundraising event called Funniest in the Fort from some folks from Fort Wayne, Indiana. And then on the 30th, migrating multiple events to a virtual environment. We're going to talk about a program that had like several in-person events that they've been doing for years and years, and how they migrated all of those events to an online format. And then in the middle of that, we're also going to have a webinar not focused on fundraising events, but really kind of something that was sparked because they were worried that their key donors might think that their program had shut down because of the pandemic. So they launched a campaign to really kind of keep their donors informed and engaged, and it wound up resulting in kind of increased engagement in their regular donor solicitations in the fall. And so on March 24th, our program is going to talk about that. In addition to those webinars, we have some other upcoming webinars, and you see them listed here. So that's all of my announcements. I'm going to turn things over to Kerry. So Kerry Suddes is the partner and director of training for 4 Impact, and you see their website there, and she's going to talk to you about kind of taking a different approach or having a different perspective on how you approach fundraising. And Kerry, I'm going to turn things over to you. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and let you share yours.
I will begin. Thanks so much, Todd. I appreciate it. Just quickly checking, you can hear me okay?
We can.
Fabulous. All right, let's make sure you can also see my screen here, which will hopefully be coming up. Just takes a second. All right, so I hope you can see my screen.
We
And
can.
Todd, if
Yep.
awesome, fabulous. All right, let's get going. Thank you all for being here. Appreciate the great introduction and some of the background here. Again, my name is Kerry Suddes. I mentioned there in the chat briefly, I am dialing in from Jackson, Wyoming, by way of the Midwest. I'm originally from Columbus, Ohio, which is also where our headquarters are for Impact. So we'll give you a little bit more information about our credibility here in a moment. But if it's okay with everybody, we're gonna get started. So let's do this for Impact point of view. So talking about growing your impact and your income. I actually love to start with a quote. This is a quote I use to kick off a lot of my training. Read that quote for me, right? Every organization is perfectly designed to get the results it is currently getting. If I could see any of your faces, I know that there would be some nodding heads out there. So the implications of this quote, the reason I start here, right, is simply, we're here to talk about fundraising, right? We're here to talk about funding our work, our impact. And the implications of this quote are simple, right? You're either getting the results that you want, and if that's the case, we stay the course, we work the plan. Conversely, if you're looking for different, greater, better results, then we might need to look at our design, right? We might need to actually take a look at how we've designed our organization. So you're in the right place today. We've actually spent over or close to 40 years helping organizations to redesign for impact and income success. I do want to prepare you. The next 45 minutes or so is going to be a little bit like drinking through a fire hose. We're going to cover some ground, but it really is meant to be focused on giving you some simple ideas that help you to rethink your design, that help you to think about, maybe some of you it's a redesign or it's simply a design, right? Being more thoughtful about some of the work that we're doing, the effort we're putting into this work, and what kind of results it's producing. You're going to hear some simple nuggets or one-liners. I would love to ask that if you hear something that really resonates with you, that you drop it in the chat. So there's going to be, like I said, some great one-liners. And if it resonates with you, go ahead and drop it in the chat so others can see it as well. So I mentioned you're in the right place. We've been doing this for a long time. Quick credibility. So this approach that I'm going to share with you today, this 4 impact approach, it's field tested. It's raised over $2 billion alongside of organizations like those of you on the call today, on behalf of organizations. We have a great track record, but the thing I want you to see that's most important to me is this idea of in the field. So when I share some of these stories, when I tell you about this approach or give you some tips and tools, I'm doing this work every day. So we're actually out working on behalf of organizations, making asks, talking to funders. This is not a theoretical approach. I hope that excites many of you on the phone here today. So I know many of you do amazing work and you do a lot of training and you're have got some really fantastic curriculum and the way that you reach your students. This is not going to be this is not going to be out of a textbook. So we're going to talk about those practical things that you can be doing and things that are simple, things that don't add more work to your plate. We're also going to be talking about fundraising in the time of COVID, right? In this pandemic. Like many of you, we had to make a decision, right? Do we wait until a time when we can be in person again with our funders or with people in general, right? Or do we embrace virtual visits and experiences with funders? We chose the latter. Like I know many of you had done the same, a year ago, and it's really presented some wonderful opportunities that we're going to touch on today. I'd like to start with our 4 impact point of view. So we are big on simplicity. We're big on napkin messages. I know many of you probably know what a napkin message is, right? It's boiling down your most salient, important point you want to make, and it's got to fit on a cocktail napkin. So after about 15 or 20 years of doing this work in the field, we had a huge epiphany. And it was this, that your impact drives your income, not the other way around. Your impact drives your income, not the other way around. Without me saying more, reflect on that to yourself. Why is this the big epiphany? What could this napkin message mean to you or to your organization? Reflect on that for me. In our work, as you can imagine, when the phone rings, about 99% of our work comes from referrals, which we're very proud of. But when that phone rings and we're called, it's often or always because an organization needs more what? They need more money, right? They need more funds. They need more income. Every time that happens, we have to back our way into understanding the impact. How are you saving, changing, and impacting lives? And how do we clearly, concisely, and compellingly tell that story of impact? So if your impact drives your income, not the other way around, let's talk about where we put our focus and our energy. So Earl Nightingale, if any of you have heard of him, he was a famous author many decades ago now, but he famously wrote that we become what we think about. We become what we think about. If any of you are into watching NASCAR or other race car events, right? Race car drivers know that where you put your focus is where your car is going to go. So if we reflect on this napkin and think about our focus, think about where we spend our time, what are you likely thinking about when you're focused on this income side of the equation, right? You're likely focused on budgets, on your operating needs, on restricted versus unrestricted. You might be focused on asking for money, right? If I could see any of you and ask for you to, those of you that were really psyched about asking for money to raise their hands, there would be no hands that went up, right? That's not something most people get excited about. Asking for money, special events. Now flip that around. What happens when we focus on our impact first? When we do all of our living and breathing and planning on the impact side of the equation, what are we thinking about? Well, we're probably thinking about making reading a reality for all, right? Literacy for all. We're thinking about how we can change the world or change one person's world. We're thinking about our ability to save, change, and impact lives. We get to think about relationships and how we maximize those relationships. And maybe, just maybe, we can think about that ROI, right? That return on investment. And impact is the way that we can articulate our return on investment. I want to share a quick story before we move on here. So it was a wonderful organization that came to a training of ours, and we got to talking about giving clubs and giving societies. And the executive director raised her hand to share with us that her organization had the Albert Schweitzer Society. So the Albert Schweitzer Society is $1,000. And I asked this executive director, what do you get for that $1,000, right? And she said, oh, it's wonderful. You get a brick with your name on it outside of our office in the sidewalk there. And we send you an international flag for your desk because they do international work. They export medical knowledge to developing communities around the world. And I said, well, how many people are part of the Albert Schweitzer Society? And she responded, 3, enthusiastically. And I said, well, gosh, that's an expensive brick and a flag, right? So we got to talking about what that $1,000 actually does. So again, this is an organization that exports medical knowledge. They train people from other parts of the world, especially developing countries, and villages in remote parts of the world. And for every single person that they train, there's about a $300 gap in funding. So they have some international funds that come in to help them with that, but there's a gap for every person they train. So now $1,000, it used to be a brick and a flag. Now we can talk about training 3 people. Better message, right? But we went a step further and we said, what's the impact of those 3 people? And the reason I love this story, you'll see, is that the World Health Organization tracks that information. And for every 1 out of every 3 people that they train, that person is able to go back to their community, their village, and treat or prevent 80% of the illnesses in that community. So now this organization has gone from join the Albert Schweitzer Society and get a brick and a flag to underwriting 1 village for 1 year. When you join the Albert Schweitzer Society, you're impacting 1 village for an entire year, treating and preventing 80% of the illnesses in that community. They went from 3 members to over 123 members in just 1 year, simply by telling that story differently, right? Sharing the story of impact and presenting people the opportunity to make an impact, right? Presenting the opportunity, that's different than asking for money. Think about that from the funder's point of view. Funders actually want to solve a problem, right? They want to have an impact. They want to save and change lives. But oftentimes the message they hear is an income message. Give to our event. Give to our annual fund. So we need to be doing that in more of an impact-driven way. And a tip for everybody watching this, recorded or live here, is ask someone what kind of impact they want to have, right? Nobody ever does that. Ask that person that you're with, what kind of impact do they want to have? And if you're truly saving, changing, and impacting lives, and you're speaking to a person that wants to do just that, right? Somebody who cares deeply about adult literacy, it's no longer about the money, right? It's no longer about asking for money, but instead presenting them that opportunity to do something that they want to do. So impact drives income. This is a point of view that I'll come back to a couple more times today. This is a napkin that I could talk off of for the next 8 days, to be quite honest with you. It's that important. It's that central to everything else that you're going to hear me talk about today. And with that, I mentioned sharing the story. I want to touch on story, right? And I'm sharing a quote here from a wonderful book called The Power of Story by Jim Loehr. Some of you may have seen it. The most important story you will ever tell about yourself is the story you tell to yourself. There's a mindfulness to this quote. To be aware of the stories that we tell. And I want to do a couple examples of what I think are some of the flawed stories that we tell related to fundraising. Let's start with not-for-profit, right? We are the only sector that defines itself in the negative. It would be like Starbucks saying we are a not tea company, right? It makes no sense. Many not-for-profits, right? We start our stories with we are a 501c3 not-for-profit charity versus we exist for a reason, right? We are working to solve a problem in our community. We are working to help that 1 in 6 adults who can't read a book to their kids change that reality for themselves. So instead of a not-for-profit, right, we're going to talk about how instead you talk about what you're for. I want to talk about one other story that I believe is flawed as it relates to this fundraising world, right? I don't like to ask people for money. Maybe some of you have said that to yourselves. You may be nodding your head. Again, if you're with a person who cares about your work, it's not about the money. About half of our work is with funders. They are looking for places to have an impact. They are literally waiting for you to come and ask. And while we're on the topic of people and prospects and funders and donors, right? There are flawed stories that we tell about our funders. We say, oh, they can't make a gift, right? They just gave a big gift to the university or to the museum. That story, right? When we tell ourselves that story, we're making a decision for someone without their input. We're putting ourselves in competition with other amazing organizations, right, that are having an impact. Versus a different story, right? That this is someone who cares deeply about our work. They have capacity, and I'm going to go try to spend some time with them. Take a moment. I want you to think about a fundraising story that's not working for you, that's not working for your organization. It's up to you to choose a more positive story. And with that in mind, it's helpful for me to do a little vocabulary, right? When we talk about changing the story or choosing a more positive story, there's a lot of thinking in this not-for-profit fundraising space that goes back a long way. And we really think about this as old thinking. And of course, we have some things we'd like to offer you that are new or different. When I take something away from you, I want to offer you something to replace it. And of course, this first one, right? Not for profit. The new thinking here is for impact. You can be for your impact, right? That's a decision that you can choose each and every day. Inform, right? When it comes to fundraising, we think about how we have to go out and inform people, right? Or if more people just knew about our work, that would do the trick. I want to offer you a challenge there. Instead of informing, how do we engage more? And ideally, how do we engage more one-to-one? Getting into one-on-one conversations with more of our best and most promising relationships. On the board. So I love this one. If you just simply cross out that middle article, you're left with on board, right? How do we get more people on board with our impact at the work that we do? Versus thinking about how to get people on the board. Not all of your champions or your funders want to be on your board, but it doesn't mean they're not on board with your work. So on board, we're thinking about how we can best utilize champions for our work. Donor and donation. Just think some word association in your mind for me. When you hear donor, what do you immediately think of? When you hear that word donor, think of blood, right? Or words organ. So a new way of thinking here is all about investors and investment. Said another way, how do we just get more people invested in our work? And of course, I gave you this final one around asking for money. Nobody loves asking for money, but there's a simple shift that you can make in your thinking, in your attitude, that can get you really, really much more comfortable with this idea of asking. And that is that you're there to present the opportunity. You're there to give someone the opportunity to do something that they want to do. So changing your vocabulary, thinking differently about your work. I'm going to be sharing some resources after this webinar, and this is just a handful of some of the vocabulary that we feel very strongly about changing, and you can find that on your website. I'll make sure in my follow-up notes that I'll offer you some direction on our learning library online that gives you some more of this vocabulary, and this becomes a wonderful resource for you to share with others in your organization, prompts some really great conversation amongst your team and your board and others that care about your work. So I'd like to to take a step forward and think about a simple way to frame a funder conversation. So many of you showed up here today, right? Fundraising in a pandemic, tips and tricks, right, of how to, some new ideas for fundraising. What I'm about to share with you is really our most used framework. And this is something that we call our altitude framework. We use this framework for a variety of purposes within our approach and how we think about our work. And today, I want to use it to think about the 3 questions of every funder at altitude. So we believe that every funder has 3 big questions and they live at altitude. So let's touch on this for a moment, right? 30,000 feet. We chose this because this is the altitude at which a plane cruises, right? Cruising altitude, 30,000 feet. If you're a person that loves to sit, back when we could get on airplanes, you love to sit at the window seat. When you look out, you could almost see the earth curving away. You're so high. So at this altitude, we're all about starting with why, or talking about our purpose. There are over 1.5 million not-for-profits, right, in the US alone. It's imperative that we understand how to talk about our why. It's imperative that we start at this level. So the big question of every funder, of course, is why do you exist, or to what end? So we talked about not-for-profit, right? We define ourselves in the negative, the only sector that does this. I take that a step further. Being a not-for-profit does not equal your reason for existence. You don't exist because you don't get to make any money, right? You exist to solve a problem, to make a person's life better or more fulfilling. When you see this to what end question, right? Tell me how the world looks different because of your impact. And I want you all to process this for me. Again, one of my goals here is to give you what I would call altitude awareness. So we're still just up at 30,000 feet here. How many of you have ever been perhaps in a funding conversation with a funder, or gosh, maybe you're just sat down on a plane or at a dinner party, meeting new people, and they say, tell me what you do, right? Think about those funder conversations where you walk in and the very first thing the funder does is, okay, tell me about your literacy program, right? This altitude awareness is such an important idea in that it allows you to say, I would love to tell you what we do. Could I first tell you why we do it? So it's actually really challenging to go down to this next level of altitude when you haven't talked about why. So that what lacks the context of why. Some of you may be thinking, but what about my really close funders, right? What about my board members or people who've been supporting us for a long time? I promise you, right? This idea of starting with why, even with some of your best funders, I don't know if I've ever talked with you about why literacy has been important to you. Or I don't know if we've ever really talked about our big vision as an organization and where we want to go. Would it be okay if we spent some time on that today? So 30,000 feet. Selling happens at 30,000 feet, right? We must sell our purpose, our why. So if 30,000 feet is cruising altitude on a plane, 14,000 feet for me is the top of the mountain. So we have one 14er here in the state of Wyoming. I believe Colorado has something like 53 if you've ever climbed a 14er, right? The top of the mountain, we're not quite up at the curvature of the earth, but we're also not down on the ground. 14,000 feet is all about the what, right? And that second big question of every funder, even if they don't say it in this way, they're thinking, tell me where the money goes. Tell me where the money goes. So the key at 14,000 feet, and something I hope you'll take away, is that we need to work to make sure people, I apologize, I said that wrong, but the key here is just not making people work to understand what it is that we do at 14,000 feet. Instead, you can simplify using something we call the rule of three. So you may have heard about the rule of three. It's used in marketing messages and politics, which we've all been inundated with recently. But the rule of three is really simple. It basically says, when you have two of something, it creates conflict, an either or. Anything more than three in the brain is inclined to give up. So if you think about Stephen Covey's 7 Habits, right? Or the 10 Commandments, it's hard to rattle those off of the top of your head, right? Instead, we can answer this question using the rule of three. You can answer this question by articulating your 3 biggest funding priorities. People, programs, places is an example. Research, education, service, right? And then asking your funder, these are our 3 biggest priorities. I can talk in great detail about all 3. Which is most important to you, right? So if we're looking to have that shared understanding, the way that we can do that is to simplify, to engage with a funder, to get them talking, right? Which is most important to you? So 3 feet here. This is boots on the ground, right? What's your plan? What do you need to make your impact happen? From the funder's perspective, they just want to know, how can I help, right? So when we start up here at 30,000 feet and move our way down, we're actually getting permission to proceed, right? We're getting their engagement at each level. And now they're saying, wow, I had no idea that you did all of this. What do you need from me? How can I help? And of course, this is where we simply respond, we'll get back to you. I hope some of you laughed at that. I can't hear you. But I'll get back to you is not what I'm recommending you say, but instead, I want to offer you an answer to that question. How could I help? And I hope that sounds good to some of you on the call here today. But I want to offer you an answer to this question, how can I help? And this can serve as your new mantra in thinking about funding and thinking about talking to people who care about your work. You can say, I'm so glad you asked, right? When someone says, how can I help? I'm so glad you asked. I'm talking to everybody about 3 things. So champion, invite, invest. That can become your new mantra. So for those of you out there that are responsible for funding the vision of your organization, for others who maybe aren't necessarily on the front lines doing the asking, maybe you're a board member, a volunteer, right? This can still be a great mantra for our organization. Champion, invite, and invest. So let's talk about these, right? Be a champion for adult literacy. We need more voices in the community telling our story, right? For some of your best relationships, you might simply say, thank you. You've been one of our best champions. For some of you, champion might be that we're offering people opportunities to volunteer, right? In a classroom or delivering our curriculum. But being a champion, right? Inviting others. So I love this one because it helps for those of you out there that have told yourself a story that says we don't know anyone, right? Or our board members aren't well connected. You can say to a funder, right, a relationship and maximizing a relationship is to say, I know I need to be talking to more people like you. Could you invite 1 or 2 others to learn more about the work that we're doing here? Invite others to get engaged with us. And finally, of course, is invest in our impact. Invest in a way that is commensurate with your heart for this work. It's commensurate with your own personal capacity. And I believe one of the best ways that we can answer this "how can I help" question is with some math. So I know many of you are focused on literacy. We love math. And the importance of doing your math as it's tied to fundraising, to asking for people to invest. And I want to give you an example, right? Since someone says, "How can you help?" I'm glad you asked, right? We need about $2,000 per student per year. And this year we'd like to reach 1,000 students with our work. How many students would you like to underwrite? Right? That's some math. Or I'd love to talk with you today about underwriting 5 students this year. Is that something you can do? So I shared with you that one village for 1 year earlier, right? That's what we would call a funding rationale. And you can build those funding rationales in your organization, right? A really simple one is taking your operating budget and dividing it by number served, right? So now we get that one village for 1 year, or help by underwriting a student, or underwriting the specific program. I saw in some discovery work, some of you bring, right, authors to a community, right? Could you underwrite this program for us this year, our author program? So responding to that question, how can I help, with a really clear funding rationale. I think it's time, and I think it's appropriate, of course, you know, as I share some of this with you, that we do take a minute and talk about this idea of impact and impact income in a COVID-19 context. This last year has been challenging for all of us, and like many of you, we found that silver lining, right? In that we can still continue to meet with funders virtually. So we can't meet with people one-on-one. We still can't in person. We can't bring people to our program to see our impact. But I mentioned this earlier. It really left us with 2 options: is that we aren't talking to people, right? Which we know is not going to work. So instead, we have to embrace the virtual. We have to embrace how we recreate some of those experiences. The challenge most people bring up is that it's not the same as being in person, and of course it's not. It's a much lower fidelity. But there's a flip side to that, and the opportunity it creates to access more people, right? In a virtual world, hopefully we can get more conversations with people that perhaps we wouldn't have had access to before. So a quick little piece of this that I want to show you in an impact income context is, of course, many of you are probably already doing this, but you're talking to your funders about what's changed for you, how you've had to innovate because of this disruption, the opportunities that that's presented, and beginning to sort and package those opportunities using this simple framework, right? Today, tomorrow, and timeless. Today, here's how we're addressing this crisis on the ground, right? We went hybrid so we can still reach some of our students. Tomorrow is post-crisis. We know our students will need us more than ever. The trauma and stress of the last year or more, not being able to get online, lost time, and of course, timeless, which is crisis independent. These are the things that are foundational to who we are as an organization. This gives you the dexterity to talk about a lot of different possibilities. With all of this in mind, I'm hopeful that you'd be excited to have me finally reveal here, 20 minutes in, that there is a secret. There is a secret to success here. There is a secret to fundraising. And if I could ask my audience if this is something you're interested in, I'm hoping that a couple of you would raise your hands enthusiastically. So here it is, right? This is the fundraising secret. Just ask. Just ask, or always ask. If any of you have ever used the word cultivation in your fundraising work, this is the opposite of cultivation. We typically cultivate because we can't communicate. Just ask is the opposite of cultivation because it implies a sense of urgency. Just ask is polite, it's assertive, it's authentic. It's that reminder that until we ask, they can't say yes. And you'll notice here what it doesn't say, right? It doesn't say just ask when the butterflies are gone, right? After we've had 9 meetings, when we know exactly what to ask for, when we have the perfect message. It says just ask. Ask early and often. Just ask is definitely an attitude in our work and this point of view and the approach that we use. This is an attitude we take everywhere with us. But there's also a word here that's helpful to define, right? Like, what is an ask? For our team, for ourselves, right? Our organization, for our funders, what do we mean by ask? And there's a way that we define an ask, and it's got 3 parts. So in an ideal world, an ask is done one-on-one, right? I mentioned that earlier. It's face-to-face or virtual, where you've got a smaller audience. There's specificity tied to numbers, right? Our funder knows what we're asking for. We're getting numbers on the table. And finally, that we've created space for dialogue. When you just ask early and often, right, there's actually more that comes after that. An ask isn't always just a singular moment in time. There's the dialogue that goes along with that. And how we create the space to do that is so important to me. I had a client call me up recently and they were really pretty dejected. So this is pre-COVID, but it's still relevant today. And this client called up and he said, we had our big gala and we got our students up on stage. We wowed the audience. Some people were even so moved that they were brought to tears. I had my #1 funder in the room, my $1 million prospect, and she only gave me $500. What did I do wrong? And so I asked this client of mine, I said, what was the ask? And he said, well, I stood up at the end and I said, prayerfully consider giving what you can. And of course, the punchline was, you got to tell them what to pray for. Prayerfully consider giving doesn't meet this definition of an ask that I just gave you. Let's take that a step further. Let's take that a step further and really look at this idea of focusing in on one-on-one with our funders. So this is an engagement ratio 1x, 10x, 30x. So 1x is 1 to many, right? So these are events, even if they're virtual. Back when we used to do galas, this can be marketing messages, mailings, right? Where we're communicating 1 to many. The average size gift here can be anywhere from $50 to $500. So this is no engagement, right? 1x is that 1 to many where we have little to no engagement with a funder. You can multiply this number by 10 simply by getting more one-on-one conversations and asking more people, what kind of impact do you want to have? And when that's aligned with the work we do, giving them a chance to invest. 30x, of course, we can multiply that number by 30 if we sit down with a handful, right, of our best and most qualified prospects. And we answer those 3 big questions I gave you earlier. The 3 big questions of every funder, you can multiply that number by 30 by doing that with a handful of your best investors. If you can be moving some of your energy just simply from 1x activities to 10x, just this little bit, that energy, moving to more one-on-one, you're going to see those different results that we talked about earlier, right? That redesign. So going from events and marketing messages and mailings and social media to just thinking about how you can get more face-to-face conversations, moving that energy into a more productive space. Energy is an important term for me. So my title sometimes is coach. I spend a lot of time coaching organizations. And one of my favorite things to do is talk about return on energy, right? We are all spread so thin. And so thinking about our energy becomes so important. So I want to share this axiom that we use, which is called 97-3, right? If you've ever heard of Pareto's rule, which is 80-20, this is 80-20 on steroids. This is Pareto's rule on steroids. And the best way to articulate 97-3 for me is to tell you a quick little story here. Lions, mice, and antelope. A lion can actually hunt, capture, and kill a field mouse. Unfortunately, the caloric intake of that field mouse is less than the energy that they expended. Conversely, a lion can hunt, capture, and kill an antelope. Takes a little bit more patience, planning, and persistence. But when they do that, the pride feasts for days. So here's what we see in a lot of organizations, right? 97-3, 97% of your funds are actually going to come from 3% of your family or your funders. But what I see organizations doing time and time again is putting all of their energy into the 97% who give 3% of our funds, right? So this is the top part of my diagram here. We're putting a lot of energy, trying to talk to a lot of people and not getting the funds that we need. So ROE is return on energy, ROR is return on relationship, and ROI is return on investment. This top diagram, this is worst practice, right? Worst practice. So we want to flip that around and instead be thinking about how we can still expend energy, but we want to do that with the top of the pyramid, our best and most qualified prospects, in order to get those funds that we need. So in looking at the top of this pyramid, I want to take that a step further. There's something that we do here, and it's having one list, and we call this a master prospect list, MPL for short. And this is made up, it's one list. It's made up of our current funders, our future aspirational funders, our past funders. It's individuals, it's institutions, it's corporations, it's all on one list. And it's ranked, or it's organized most qualified down, right? Versus alphabetical. And there's really two things that we're looking for our prospects to have. So when this human here, right, we're looking for two things for them to have in order to meet our definition of a qualified prospect. They need relationship, right? Or heart for our work. And they need capacity. They need the ability to make an investment in our work. These are the two things that define a qualified prospect in our approach. They don't meet that definition, right? They don't go on your master prospect list. And it doesn't mean that we don't care about the people that don't meet this definition, that we don't have a lot of wonderful people engaged in our work. It's just knowing that when we come to this fundraising work, that we're able to build our focus around our best and most qualified relationships. So I want you to think about, who are your top 3 best and most qualified prospects? Your next 10. Who are your top 3 champions? Write those down. Using this master prospect list sorted by most qualified, not alphabetical, it actually ensures that you're going to spend more time with better prospects in order to get that funding that you need, right? So again, when we look at this best practice, it's all about getting that focus, getting that return on energy that's so important. So we're in our last couple minutes here, and I just want to really kind of hone in on one final piece that's important to me, and it's really a continuation of that conversation about engagement, right? How we engage our funders. So often, we're really focused on that pitch, right? Nailing that elevator pitch, which is that traditional approach we hear so much about. You have only a couple floors to do that monologue, get as much info out as you can, but we all know that when we do that, the other person's eyes glaze over. So instead, I want you to ditch that pitch and focus on elevator engagement. What does elevator engagement sound like, right? If the best story begins in your funder's head, then asking questions is the best way to get there. So engagement, it sounds like you asking a lot of questions. What do you know about adult literacy, or why has adult literacy been important to you? What kind of impact are you trying to have on this community, or what kind of legacy are you hoping to leave? So asking questions becomes vital. Of course, there's a corollary to that, right? We know how important listening is. And one of the best ways that you can be present and really listen to your funders is to simply have a visual that helps guide your conversation. And I want to offer you, just share a quick example here of an engagement tool. So this is a visual, something that we know, we love visuals, right? We have a visual guide to a conversation. What you can see here is 30,000 feet, right? 14,000 feet and 3 feet. So having a visual, this is for a client of mine that's focused on really on those that are affected by domestic violence and disrupting that, changing the story, rebuilding those lives. Here we have the rule of 3, right? Which is most important to you? And finally, having a plan, right? Here's our safe family initiatives. I'd love to talk with you about how many families you can help us with this year. So it's 11:53. I'm going to stick around here to answer some questions, but I just want to, this idea of having a visual, I'm going to share some more examples of those engagement tools with you at the end of this call. In addition to that, I'm going to share with you this downloadable, one of my favorite that you can print there and hang up in your office, but offers you some reminders of some of the things that we talked about today, some really simple challenges, right, around being for impact, and some guiding principles that will help remind you of some of this work that you can do. So we're actually going to go ahead and move into our Q&A session. And I'm going to ask, I believe, Todd, you're going to help me to manage some of the questions that have come in.
I absolutely am. And while people are taking a few moments to type in their questions into the Q&A section, I'm just going to remind everybody, if you have questions for Kerry, please get those questions in now. She's agreed to stick around and make sure everybody's questions get answered, but we are going to be respectful of her time and kind of cut off questions at the top of the hour. And Kerry, as you were going through that, it really made me think of 2 things. One, when I was first starting out in literacy at a literacy program in Memphis, Tennessee, I went to a presentation on fundraising, and that idea of asking for money. This
Yeah.
person was presenting that same kind of concept, and what he said was, you're not asking people for money. What you're doing is taking somebody in your community who wants to have an impact on your community, and the resource that they have have that impact is money. That's the resource they have.
That's right.
And the service that you're providing them is connecting them to a good cause that's going to make good use of their resource. And when he said that, like, that really, as you were saying, it kind of flipped my thinking about what I about how I approached talking to people about investing in our literacy program. And then the other thing is kind of recognizing here in the pandemic, as we're not able to have those fundraising events, it really provides us with a great opportunity to do that flip you're talking about and think about who those people are that are our kind of primary donors, that could be our primary supporters on that list, and taking some time to spend with them. And while uh, it might not be reasonable to invite people into your school to sit in on a classroom or something like that, there's maybe a lot more opportunities for those folks to sit in on a virtual classroom and really get a sense of what their investment is doing for
Yeah,
the students in your program. So those are just a couple of my thoughts. And
I love
we
it.
do have a couple of questions. So
All
uh,
right.
our first one is, how do we break through to the next generation of investors who are thinking more about the here and now rather than the future?
All right. Good question, Rob. I'm going to tackle this though, first and foremost, right? For me, I want to know first and foremost that we've maximized our current investors and relationships. I love that you used investors there, right? I know you want to talk about more or the next generation, but man, it's important for me to put that out there of if we haven't maximized, right? So I offered you these three big questions of every funder until we've had that conversation with our current funders. It doesn't make sense to talk about new or more or changing our approach for this next generation. But I think your question also speaks to me around the uniqueness of each of these relationships. So I talked to you about having that master prospect list, right? This isn't about engaging potentially with hundreds of people or institutions or corporations or wherever your funding sources are, partners. That some of you go to the United Way, right? They should be at the top of our master prospect list as well. But it's not necessarily about hundreds of engagement or trying to guess what somebody's thinking. I actually go the opposite direction, right? Is if that person is qualified, if we've determined that this is someone who has a heart for this work and they have some capacity, the next step is to actually get that audience, right? Let's go ahead and have that one-on-one conversation with them. So I hope that helps, Rob. I see this next question, Todd, I can kind of flip through these unless you want to answer.
Actually, I think it's kind of helpful if I say them out loud for the recording.
Fabulous.
So,
okay.
Yeah, so the next question is really on hosting virtual fundraising events in lieu of actual events due to the pandemic, and what does the return on investment look like for virtual events?
Yeah, such a good question. Okay, let's talk about this. So there's a great example that, again, so many companies had to pivot at the beginning of this pandemic, and Airbnb was one of them, right? So they actually pivoted and said, we're going to host these, really cool experiences, right? And they'd have a chef on the video, and you could sign up with your kids and you could learn how to make a meal, right? And when I think about this virtual space, there's one thing you should know about us. We're not crazy about special events, right? They have a low return on investment, right? We put a ton of energy in and we don't always get the return that we're looking for. So we think about them, we want to shift. If I'm going to take away special events, I want to replace it with memorable experiences. That's what Airbnb did, right? How do we create some more memorable experiences and engage people and not worry about those necessarily being fundraisers, right? Which is what we typically call events. We say, oh, it's a fundraising event. Instead, I want you to think about them, opportunities to engage, opportunities to wow an audience, right? If you invite people to a virtual event, maybe they get to sit in on your program, or we have some of the people we impact sharing their stories. We don't have to worry about doing fundraising in that moment, right? Or making a big ask. Instead, think about who you would want to invite to that event. Maybe you don't need hundreds of people there, right? Maybe you need a handful of really good people that are good prospects for your organization. And you can use that to do something we call predispose. So now your virtual events can become predisposition for those one-on-one conversations. That helps you. If you do that predisposition, it helps you maximize when you actually get that maybe 30 minutes to talk with one of the attendees to your event, right? They're a qualified prospect and you get that follow-up conversation. Now you get to use that event and say, what did you think? What was your biggest takeaway? What was your biggest wow? So I hope that helps, Sandy, answer your question. Thanks so much.
I think that was a great answer, and it reminds me of our next webinar on the virtual spelling bee, and this was actually an event that the presenter is going to talk about, that they just felt kind of what you were saying, of not hosting it as a virtual fundraiser, but really just an opportunity to make sure they stayed engaged with key donors that had supported their program through years during the pandemic, when there was an opportunity to kind of lose that engagement and lose that interest. And so they didn't host it as a fundraising event at all. And it still wound up generating income, but it resulted in them having a different perspective in the purpose of the event, and they got a lot of really great feedback. So I'd encourage folks who are kind of interested in that to attend that next webinar. So we have a really good question. I think it's kind of a starting point question from Wendy. How do you start to enlist investors? And I'm gonna kind of expand on that a little bit and say, especially for folks that don't have, you
Mm.
talked about kind of going through and looking at the people that have donated to your program and kind of putting them on that uh, uh, list of where
Mhm.
you're going to invest time. What if you don't have folks that are good prospects? Like you don't,
Yeah.
you know, where do you start finding those folks that are good prospects?
Yeah. Um, I love it. It's a great question. So, today we really were sort of living at 30,000 feet, if you will, and we have a ton of resources on our website. But there's really a three-step process that I think about using when it comes to enlisting investors. But furthermore, I think your question might have been about identifying, right?
Hmm.
So this is the first step, is identification, right? We have on our website 5 different sources of prospects that you can use. There's 3 steps. That first one of identification for me, it truly is just doing a brain dump, right? Bringing together some key people in your organization and just getting good names down on a sheet of paper. I mean, truly, this step, we're not trying to figure out, how we're going to approach them. How are we going to get an audience with them? We're just saying these people, they fit our definition of a prospect, right? They have a heart for our work. Gosh, that was a really bad heart. Sorry. They have that relationship and they have capacity. They have those 2 things. They fit that definition of a qualified prospect. So there's a bunch of resources that I'll make sure you get in sources of prospects. That can be, past giving history. We use something called an ideal prospect profile. But these next 2 are just as important when I think about enlisting these investors. The second one is that we begin to do that prioritizing, right? We need a way to look and see who our best prospects are, right? That helps you with your energy, ROE. It helps you know to say, I don't have to, it's not about equal energy across the board. I can look at that and go, here are my top 3 prospects. How do I think about maximizing those relationships? And that's really where that third step comes in for me. And what I believe is that your top, at a minimum, for some organizations on the smaller side, your top 3, for other larger and probably beyond, but your top 3 or top 10 best prospects. And again, these can be people you already know, but they all deserve and need a written strategy. How are we going to approach them? How are we going to get that audience? What are we going to say when we get there? How are we going to ask? So those are my recommendations. I hope that's helpful in thinking about how to enlist, right? So get those good names, really work to push yourself to prioritize, so that you're doing the right amount of return on energy. And then being really intentional about strategy. There's some resources on our website here. They're definitely a little more advanced, but a wonderful resource nonetheless. I hope that helps.
I think that was great. I think that was great. Here's a final question, and I think it's a really good one from Lucy. So she says, so nowadays some organizations have removed
Yeah.
themselves from the donation process, and we fill out generic forms that are managed by another company. While our content then has to shine, any other tips for this new way of requesting funds?
I have to say, I mean, Lucy, this is not a place I have a ton of expertise. Yeah, I mean, for me, I realize there's a lot of other uh, uh, kind of opportunities, and donation forms, or having the donate now button on your website, and that goes to a third party. This is very different, this approach I'm offering you today. I mean, it really is, because you're saying there our content has to shine, right? And to me, it's the difference between marketing and sales, is that you're trying to get someone else to tell your story really well, right? In a marketing, with a marketing lens. almost everything I presented to you today is a corollary or a complement to marketing. And a lot of nonprofits do a ton of marketing, right? Trying to get that message to the masses, or I offered it earlier, right? The one to many way that we sometimes focus our energy. And I'm actually trying to shift you to more of a sales approach, right? And just getting, and not, when your content has to shine, instead, I want you to engage with a funder, right? We have a rule where we say a 2-to-1 rule for dialogue. So the 2-to-1 rule for dialogue means that you're getting them to talk twice as much as you are. So now you're not worried about your content shining. You're actually getting them to talk about impact. You're using their words to frame your program or to talk about the work that you're doing. So I don't know if that directly helps you, Lucy. But that's my my 2 cents on that. Is it's a shift. It's a shift from marketing to sales.
Yeah, Kerry, I think that was kind of what I was thinking about that question too, is that donate button online where
Mhm.
you're then filling out a form. That's kind of somebody winds up there as a result of marketing, but that's not really how you're looking to have that that person that you're developing that relationship with to make an investment in your organization to have the impact that they want. That's not how you're wanting to relate to them, is through that donate button on your website. You're really building a more personal relationship, and then that donate button is just
Yeah.
what you've decided to make an investment. How can we make that more convenient for you,
Yeah.
right? Is
Well,
that making that investment online or sending us a check or
totally.
what?
That's where we close the gift. And yeah, I would be remiss if I didn't just highlight, this energy that I'm asking you, moving away from sort of that virtual or an email, right? Or a social media message where we're requesting funds to more of a one-on-one conversation. It's a shift in energy, right? So some of those things we want them to be sort of turnkey, right? Very low, kind of passive. Um, and I acknowledge and I'm aware that when I ask you to shift some of this energy, right, that um, that it doesn't feel replicable, right? You're immediately, your brain goes to, why? How do I do that with tons of people, right? And I'm actually saying, don't do it with tons or hundreds or even 50. Start off with that top 3 or top 10. Next 20, right? Maybe you have 33 names on a sheet of paper, and over the course of a year, you work to get a conversation with each and every one of them where you're looking to maximize, or you're looking to answer those 3 big questions of every funder. So again, I get a little soapboxy on that last point, but I hope it's relevant.
No, I think it absolutely is. And Kerry, that wraps up our all of our questions. So I want to say thank you for a wonderful presentation and getting us started on this idea of kind of coping with how we're going to approach raising um, investments in our organizations during the pandemic, and helping folks stay aware of the good work that we're doing and the good impact that we're having in our communities. And I want to thank people for attending. It looks like you're going to wrap us up with a quote.
Yes. Since I mentioned sales, I'll just leave you with this. It's one of my favorites, right? Sales is the forging of a human connection. So offering you a really great definition of sales and thinking about, as an organization, how do we make a commitment, right? How do we make, if we've got marketing in place, how do we make a commitment to getting that complement of more human engagement, more forging of that human connection? So Godspeed. I know you all are doing amazing work. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. And thank you everybody for attending. And hopefully we'll see you in a couple of weeks on our next webinar. Thank you very much. Everybody have a great day.
Bye. Thanks.